One of the beauties of working with WordPress is the use of dynamic data. And one visual development environment that works beautifully with dynamic data in WordPress is Builderius. Now you might be asking yourself, what exactly is dynamic data and do I really need it? So now let's look at an example of a real estate website. In this website, we have the header section and it contains your site logo and your navigation menu. Now imagine for each of those separate pages, because each item in the navigation menu is a separate page. Imagine you had to now start creating your menu over and over again for each page. That would be a lot of work. And then if you want to change some items, you now have to go to every page and make changes to those items. Then for a filtering system like this, where you want to filter by property, because this is a real estate website, you might have many properties that you're listing, and maybe one property gets sold out, another one gets added, one is rented out, and all of that. How do you now manage all of that data? And how do you manage the filtering system as well for that data? If I click on the drop down, we get a list of the locations for the property. Now, if I'm doing all of this manually, I am prone to make mistakes. But if everything is done dynamically, that means I put the content once somewhere on the back end, and then it automatically populates into the right sections. Just think about it. If you have to give your content editors this job to be putting the information into all of the right places, like for example, you want to show featured images, they have to come in here and manually have to add the featured properties themselves. It will be too much work, and maybe you want to now change one featured property, you have to now come back into the page, change it here, and maybe you had the featured properties in 4 different pages. You now have to go to those 4 pages and edit the content. So you most likely make a lot of mistakes. Things like testimonials as well, because your clients probably they keep sending in testimonials, and you just want to keep up to date with maybe the one that has the averagely highest rating or something like that, that will just automatically populate onto the homepage. You can do that automatically rather than having to do it manually. You can also show a list of all of your agents on the website. So this is a very good use case for dynamic data. Another important use case is, let's go to the properties. We can also have a filtering system for our properties. If this was static, it would have been a lot of work, but because it's dynamic, everything is easy. And let's say I go into one of the properties. You see that each property takes on a similar design. So this is one property, it has a design. Go to another property, it has a similar design, a similar look with the gallery and all of this content. So the design stays the same. Then all you have to worry about is the content. And then maybe somewhere down the line, you think, oh, I want to change the formatting of the prices. Maybe I want the prices to now show 50p or 50 cents or whatever currency you use. You can just go back into the template, modify the template, and it will just auto-populate to all of the content that you already have existing on the website. So this makes it easy because your template for the page is different from the content of the page. It makes it easy to even port your website from one design layout to another. So let's go ahead and see how we can now start populating our website with dynamic data. So I will not be starting from scratch. We're focusing on dynamic data in this case. So I've created an identical website, and this one currently has static data. So everything here is manually put in. Even the filtering system was done manually. So now we're going to see how we can convert this manual website into a dynamic website, so that whenever we say we will add a new location, it will automatically populate a new location on the home page. If we tick the box for featured property, it will automatically populate on the home page, and so on. So you have that freedom to put in your content in one environment and it auto-populates to the entire template. To understand the whole concept, the first thing we need is to create your template. Then within that template, you add in what I will refer to as slots. So those slots is where your content will now go into. And in WordPress, there are 2 types of content. The first type of content we have are posts, and the other type are users. So those are the 2 basic types of content that we have in WordPress. Then those posts can now be divided into what we call types. By default, we have posts and pages as types of posts. Then, if you have something like WooCommerce installed, then you get products as well as another type of post. Then, in terms of the users, we have what we call the user roles. So you can have something like administrator, we have the editors, the authors, subscribers, and so on. So that's how we divide users. So coming back to posts, those are the broad grouping of posts. So posts and pages are broad grouping of posts, but you can now group them further using what we call taxonomies. The native taxonomies we have are our categories and our tags. So that's how the grouping goes into play. We use those categories and tags to allow us to do filtering on the front end. So let's say you want to filter by a specific category. You can now use those categories or the tags to filter our posts. But those are still very limited because only having just two types of content. So we have like attachment for our images, then we have the post, then we have pages, and then we have products. That's just not enough. What if you're now building a real estate website? You may want to now give a broad classification of your posts that are related to properties. So you can now create what we call a custom post type using any of these plugins like ACPT, ACF, Metabox, Jet Engine, ASE, Pods, and so many other ones. So those are plugins that extend the native WordPress post system, and then they give you extra functionality. So you can now say, okay, I don't just want posts and pages. I want to have a specific post type called properties, or a specific post type called taxonomies, or one that's called testimonials, and so on. So those are like broad types of posts. Then you can also create custom taxonomies, like, okay, what is the location of those properties? Or what are the types of the properties? Is it a flat? Is it a penthouse? And so on. So we now use these custom post types and custom taxonomies to create a better structure on our website. Then finally, we have the post meta or the meta fields. So by default, WordPress has some properties that go with each post. So we have the post title, we have the excerpt for the post, we have a featured image for the post, then we have the block content where the actual content goes in. But that may not be enough because you may want to add some extra slots into your template that you can now add content to. So with that, we now use any of these other plugins again, like I've mentioned, the ACF and the Metabox and so on, to create custom fields. So we can now create like a specific number field for prices, so that when our content editor goes into the website, they just see that point called price and they just add the price of the property, rather than having to write out the entire full content without knowing the structure. They can easily mess the structure up. But once you've now structured your content into slots, so say, okay, what is the price, or what is the square footage, or something like that. So all of that, it just makes life easy when adding content. So now let's look at the example of one that I've created for my real estate website, and then we'll see how we can now populate templates with the dynamic data, and we'll also see how we can manipulate dynamic data in many ways, which is why we are using Builderius. So now let's take a look. So here we are in the WordPress backend. The first thing I'll do is show you the plugins we're using. So under plugins, the key plugins we're using are ACF Pro to create those meta fields, the custom post types and taxonomies. Then we have Builderius and Builderius Pro. That is our visual development environment to bring the entire template together. Then we'll now go over to ACF and see the post types that I created. So post types, I've created one called agents, one called properties, one called testimonials, and so on. Then I've also created taxonomies for the location of those properties, the type of the properties, and so on. Then if you go under field groups, I've now created some fields that should go into our posts, because by default, like I've mentioned, they are not enough. We need some extra fields to make life easy when editing content, so that we don't miss out on any content. So if you go into something like the property details, you see things like overview. Then we have the address, the price, the number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, and so on. So each of them, we assign them to a specific type of content. One is a text field, then we have things like the number field, so that you can only add numbers to those fields and not anything else. Then we have repeaters as well, and so on. So those are different types of fields. Some of these fields are specific to the pro versions of maybe ACF or Metabox or Jet Engine. So some of them might be limited if you are trying to use the free version. But you have relationship fields, taxonomy fields, and so on. And then the next thing we now do is see how we set up Builderius. So for me, if I go under Builderius and then I go to Home, I typically go with the minimal setting because I have already my own system that I like to work with. So my own CSS framework, I already have my own components that I work with for the site navigation and things like that. But note that if you're using the minimal settings, nothing will be added to your site. So your site is going to be a blank slate. There will be no header component. There will be no footer component. There will be nothing. It will just be blank space. You have to now go in and fill in the information yourself. So you have to create your own navigation menu yourself. You have to add the CSS for the navigation menu. You'll have to add other things that you need to add as templates and so on. So there'll be blank slate, no templates, nothing. But for this example, I have already created the templates. All we're just going to do is populate that template with the right data. So if you prefer, you can go with the standard settings. This one will give you the basic structure. So it will give you a header component, a footer component already populated. It will give you a main section, but a blank main section. So you have to fill it yourself, but it will create some basic templates for you, like your posts archive templates, your pages template, and things like that. It will create them for you, but with no content. You now have to go and add the content yourself. Okay, so if I now go under templates, this is where you now create those structures. So where you are starting your structure, you start it with a template. You can have templates that go for all the properties. That's what I call the single property. So that for each property, they will all follow this template structure. And it's very easy to create. You just click on create template and then choose the type of template you want. The front page template is basically your home page template. So if you go under the reading settings and you set your home page to a specific page, this template will now attach to that page. Then the blog index is whatever you set as your blog posts page. Then we have other ones that we can look at and check them out. Okay, then the next thing we're going to do is now start to edit our template. So I'll go ahead and edit the single property template. And before we continue, I'd like you to know that there are two types of data variables in Builderius. This is basically dynamic data. We have the native and custom. The native data variables are assigned with the WP name. And basically what it means is that whenever you're on a template, Builderius will automatically pick every content that relates to that template. So things like the post title of the template, we have your post excerpt, your featured image, ACF, meta fields that are for that specific template. Everything will be pulled in automatically by Builderius. But then when you want to now reference content from another content type or another template, then you have to create what we call custom variables. We'll also see that when we're trying to do relationship fields, because basically a relationship field is connecting your current template with a separate template. Even though it's called a relationship field that is in ACF, you need to use a custom variable to access the content of that other post type that you're trying to access. And in Builderius, when we are accessing content from the data variable, we use square brackets. So there are two square brackets. That's how it always starts, with two square brackets. Then we can now access the object. And that object is WP. Then you can see something like wp.post.title. Then other ones like that. And we'll see it visually. But don't worry, you don't have to write the code yourself. You do it visually because Builderius is a visual development environment. So let's go back into the builder and now we can start. So at the moment, you see that the post that we are previewing for the template, you can see it at the top right-hand corner in the builder. If I click on the drop down, you can now choose a specific one you want to work with to get the content. But you will notice that I'm actually viewing the 11 posts, but what is showing here is 12 because it is static data. So it's getting the wrong content for the template. Now let's fix all of that. So to fix it, I'll just come to the element I want. If you are starting from scratch, you can always add a new element onto the page by clicking on the elements inserter and search for your elements there. So something like maybe a section, you get your section. We also have a quick access bar on the right-hand side, just right next to what we call the navigator. So the navigator is where you see your structured tree for your HTML. You also see your selectors, all of the things that you can style with CSS. That's where you see your selectors. You can switch between the global scope or the template level scope. That's for everything in Builderius. So either your dynamic data, your JavaScript, your CSS, they always have multiple scopes. We have the global scope, which means it affects every page that Builderius works on, or template scope, which affects only the current template. Then you can also see your CSS variables that are attached to the root, and you can always search. There's always a search for everything. So if I want to search for my color, you can go ahead and see all of the colors that I've applied to this current website, and so on. So you can search. Then we can now continue. So now let's see how we can replace static data with dynamic data. So I'll go in, I've selected my header, which is my H1 title, and I'm just going to delete the static data, and I will replace it with dynamic data. With Builderius, just like almost every other page builder, when you want to access dynamic data, you always see one dynamic stack icon. I don't know what it's called, but the dynamic stack icon. If you click on that, it now gives you all of the dynamic data that you can access in this current template. And you'll see that it's assigned to WP. So when you see WP, that means it's a native dynamic data. So now let's go ahead and search for our post title. You can, if you like, by looking at the headings, you know this is for site, that means it's a global information. So you can keep scrolling down till you see posts and then look for the post title. But for someone like me, it's hard for me to start reading through lots of content, so I like to just search. So I just search for the title, and I get to see the title, which is wp.post.title. So we are accessing WP, which is the global query, then dot post, which is within the global data variable, we're accessing the post, and then within that post, we're accessing the title. So I'll just click on it, and we get our post title accessed properly. If we want to now add for the rest, so the next one is the number of beds. So I'll get rid of the static content, and I'll search for my name of my field. So I'll just search for beds, and we now get the correct number of beds. Same thing with the rest. And that's how you just keep adding the data. So that's the first type of data. Very easy. So now before we continue, let's first understand the different kinds of return data that we have in Builderius. It's similar to what we have in JavaScript with PHP and any of these languages. We have a couple of return formats. One is a string, and that is when it is text content. So when you're writing text content, you put them in double quotes, and that represents a string. The next is a number. For that, you just write the number. You don't need to put them in quotes. When you put anything in quotes, it means it's a string. So don't put numbers in quotes. Then the next one we have are Boolean. You also don't put them in quotes. Just write them directly. So we have true or false. Then we also have arrays. For arrays, we wrap them in square brackets. So the moment you see square brackets on the return side, then you know it's an array. Because we have two sides. We have the identifier side and the return side. Is basically like an equation. So whenever you see square brackets on the return side, it is an array. Then the next one we have are objects. An object is usually with curly brackets. So when you see curly brackets, it means you're starting an object. And always, like I said, it's on the return side, not on the identifier side. And then we have null or empty, which is just quotes with nothing inside of the quotes. Okay, so these are the kinds of data that we have. So keep that in mind. That will help you out when you are returning data. And so going back to our website. The next data we'll get to is, okay, the price. Let's go ahead and fix the price. I'll get rid of the current content and I'll search for price. But you see that the number is not returned in the way we typically write our currencies. So how can we fix this? It's pretty easy. So first, we've learned about data retrieval. So that's just using the dynamic stack and searching for the data you want to retrieve. Now we'll learn a bit about data modification. So how can we now modify the data to fit our needs? Builderius has some handy functions which you can check by going to their docs. I'll leave it in the description. So you can just go ahead and search for dynamic data and read through the dynamic data section. It will show you some of the functions that exist within Builderius. And one of it is called the number format. It's similar to what you have in PHP. So if you know a bit of PHP, it will help you to understand Builderius because the language is quite similar. And you can also even use PHP directly in Builderius. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so now let's see how can we modify this data. All you have to do, if you are in the content area, right click on your dynamic data and you see what we call transform. So this transform is that we're trying to modify our data. And what we want to transform it to, we want to use the number format to format the number. Click on that. You now give it how many decimal points do you need. I don't need any decimals, I'll get rid of that. You can choose, do you want dots or comma? Because if you are in other parts of Europe, you might use dots as a separator, whereas in the UK, we use commas as our separator. So you choose the right one and you apply. And automatically, it will apply the format that you want. And finally, I can add some static data in line with my dynamic data. This is one beauty of Builderius, that you can inline multiple dynamic data together. You can use static data and dynamic data all within the same content area. Some other page builders, they restrict you, that it's very hard for you to add static data with the dynamic data. They'll give you like a small box somewhere. You can only add a few characters or something. But with Builderius, everything is open and you can do whatever you want. And there are some checks that they do in the background. Okay, so now we have most of our information all pulled in. Then we can also now learn about another thing called escaping. So let's go ahead and add in our post content. So this section, let's say it is for our post content. The about the property is using the block editor. So for content, you just search for content and you get it. So now we get our post content, but you will see that it is printing out the tags. So we have P and all of that. You don't want to be printing out the tags. You want to format it using the HTML. You want to get the unescaped version, because this is for security reasons. That's why they give you the escaped version. For all content, it's always escaped unless you deem it worthy to not be escaped, that you want to get it to run in the builder. So for that, just right click again in the dynamic data and choose on escape. And now you see that those tags are gone. It will now do it properly. Okay, so let's go ahead and save. And we'll now go to the next kind of data that we need in Builderius, and that are repeater fields. Because we have like key features, which in ACF, I defined it as a repeater. You'd see that the key features was defined as a repeater field, and then it has a sub key called feature. So it makes life easy. So now let's go back into the builder. So whenever we have things that repeat, whether it is a repeater field, it is a listing or a loop of posts or anything, as long as it is something that is repeating, a dynamic data that repeats, we can use what we call the collection element. That's a special element in Builderius. So we use the collection element for repeater fields. So let's go ahead and add in the repeater field. So I'll go to the wrapper content. So that's for the key features, the wrapper. And I'll go ahead and insert element and I'll search for collection. It's also in your side panel as well. So you can choose to just go directly to your quick access panel. And I've added it, but it's always add as the last item within the wrapper that you select. So now I can drag it back up to the top. And now we have our collection before our features list. And I think this is going to be better used as a UL-li structure. So on the collection element, I'll convert it from a div to a UL. So now I have my UL structure. The way it works with Builderius dynamic data with the collection element is you define the source of your repeating fields on the wrapper element. So you define the source of your dynamic data in the wrapper element. The thing that you want to be repeating, that is the output, you define the output inside of the template. So on the wrapper, you define the source or the input. Then within the template, you add in what you want as the repeating item. So let's say in the template, I want to repeat a set of list items. So I'll go ahead and click on the elements inserter and search for list. Let me just add them to the quick access panel. So I'll look for the star icon and add them. So let me first add the list and the list item. That's just adding them to the favorites panel. Now I want to add the list item to my collection element. So now I have UL, template, and then LI. So now let's go ahead and define our source before we can define our output. So I'll go back to the UL, which is the collection element, then click on the dynamic stack icon, and automatically, the moment you use a collection element, Builderius knows that you're looking for an array of content. So it will search for all dynamic data in your builder that repeats, and then it will show you that display. It will not show you any other type of static data. Okay, so now we see that we have some repeating items. The one we need is the key features. And automatically, you can see now it's now printing out 5 items. That means it's working, because if we go into our post for 11 Mortlake, and you can see under features that we have 5 features. That means the source is working. So now all we have to do is now define the output template. So I'll go back, then let's define the output. So under the LI, Builderius is also very smart that the moment you are inside of a loop, it will show you all of the sub fields that you can access from that loop automatically. So just click on the dynamic stack icon again, and you see we can access the feature. We can also access index. Index is quite useful when you're trying to do like add some IDs dynamically. So let's say you have an accordion and you want to just dynamically add icons, or you want to even add numbering. So you want to add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 automatically. You can just use the index. It will give you the index number, and it will always start from 0. So watch out, it starts from 0, but you can always modify the data using the functions. So we can see an example. Let's say these are our key features. Let me first go ahead and style it. So I'll go under styles and I'll add some classes that I already created. Okay, so we have our styles, but let's say we want to add the number for some reason. I can go back to my LI and content, and then just put the index. But like I said, it will start from 0, then 1, 2, 3, and so on. If we want to make it start from 1, we just go into the brackets. Whenever we're in a loop, we're using curly brackets. Whenever we're outside of a loop, we use square brackets. So just remember that, but it's the same principle. So now when I'm in the curly brackets, I can just do the name of the data that we have returned, the object we're accessing. Then I just say plus 1. You can just do regular arithmetic and it will work. You can see it starts from 1 now. 1, 2, 3, and so on. So it just automatically works. You can go ahead and save it, but I don't really need the index. So let's get rid of that. And I'll save. So we've learned about repeater fields now. The next thing we'll now learn about are the relationship field, but let me get rid of the static content. We'll now learn about relationship fields and about custom variables. Because at the moment, all we've been seeing are the regular native WP variables. But now let's say we're trying to pull in information about the related agents for the current post. And remember what I said, that WP is only for the current post. When we're trying to pull in related agents, that agent is a separate post type. It's not the current post. So we need to create custom variable. So to create a custom variable, go down to the bottom. You'll see dynamic data. Click on that. It will open the dynamic data tab. Then you now have to decide, is it going to be a global or a template level variable? Remember I mentioned that with Builderius, there's always the global and template level, as well as component level. So it always give you those options. So now let's go to the template level, and I'll choose to create a variable because I'm thinking this will only be used in the current template. We're not going to use these related agents in any other template apart from the current template. Okay, so I'll call it something like listing underscore agent. Just give it a name. It can be any name. It can be a short name. It can be a long name. Something that gives you an indication of what you're trying to do. Okay, so now we have the name. So now let's learn about how everything is formed. So in Builderius, this is how it works. So first, we have the curly bracket that starts, and that is the start of our query. Then we can define what we call an alias. So this is the name that we want to give to our object that we're returning. So that's an alias. That is an optional thing you can do. So you start with an alias and then you put a colon. Then you now define the identifier, or what we call the resolver. So that is just the name. So is it going to be a post query? Is it going to be a URL parameter? Is it going to be a taxonomy query? Is it going to be something that we're pulling from the current post? All of that is the identifier for our starting of the pulling of data. After the identifier, we now have regular brackets. What we put into the regular brackets are what I will refer to as inputs. So the parameters to specify the identifier. So things like the arguments, a fallback, and anything that identifies our input. Then after all of that regular brackets, we now have a set of curly brackets. So that curly bracket is now the start of the output. What do we want to return? What object do we want to return? If our return is an object, then we now have to start defining what are the items within the object we're trying to return. So in this case, you see we're returning the post count, we're returning the posts, and then within that post, we're also using a curly bracket again. That means that post itself is an object. We're trying to now return some items within that object. So we're returning the post title now, and so on. So this is a way we are working with the custom variable. But don't worry, Builderius is quite handy and smart that it gives you autocomplete, so it will suggest how to complete any of this information you're trying to get. Now let's go back to our post and see how we start. So we've started with the opening and closing curly brackets to begin our query. We've given it a name for the data variable, and now we can start. So the first thing, let's just give it a comment to really understand what we are trying to do. So we're trying to get the related listing agent for the current property. So that means we now start from, we're trying to get for the current property. So that means we have to get what the current property is before we can get what is related to the current property. So to get what the current property is, we'll start with what they call a post. So POST. Then within the post, I'll need to get the ID of the current post because I'll use that ID to identify the related listing agent. Then the next thing I want to do is, if we're working with ACF has one handy function called the ACF relationship value. This will automatically pull in the right information for us. As long as we are in the post context, this ACF relationship value will know that it's the current post you're working with, and all we have to do is define the name of the relationship field. So I'll go back to ACF, and I think the relationship field was called listing agent. So I'll just go ahead and copy that, go back and paste it within the name. Like I mentioned, this is the identifier called ACF relationship value. In the regular brackets, I'm adding some arguments. So I'm adding what is the name to make it more specific. So I'm saying that, okay, I'm looking for the relationship field that has the following name. Then it has a set of curly brackets to say, okay, because the relationship field returns an object, returns a post object. So what do I want to get for the post object? This is one thing that differentiates GraphQL, which is what Builderius is built upon, from the REST API. If you're working with the REST API, the moment you say you want an object, it will just give you all the data for that object. With GraphQL, you specify the exact items you want to return from the object. For example, I want to return the post title, so I'll say title. For post title, I want to return, maybe let's look at the example, the job title and the featured image. So I'll say I want to return the featured image. And the featured image is also an object, so it automatically create this curly bracket to say it's an object. What are the information you want to get from this object? So I want to get the alt text, and I want to get the file URL. You may also want to get the sizes if you want to create those source sets, but that's if you want to. Then the other fields, I think they are ACF fields. So I will go ahead and get the name of the ACF field from here. And the one we're looking for is the agents field group. So let's go back to field groups. And I'm looking for the agent details. And what I'm looking for is the job title. So I'll copy that key, go back, and for ACF fields, I have to start by saying ACF, and then you see value. Then what is the name? The name is called job title. Then I'll go for the next one, ACF value. And the next one was called the phone and the email. So I'll say phone. And the last one is ACF value for the email. But you'll notice that we are getting these red underlines. Why are we getting red underlines? It's because these are identifiers, and each of them is what the query is identifying. But now you're seeing that three things are having the same identifier, and that is not allowed. You can't have three things having the same name, which is why we now use what we call aliases. So to create an alias, like I showed from the beginning, all you do is start with the name of the alias, and then you put a colon, and then that's it. So I can say the first alias is listing underscore agent, colon. Then I can say maybe the post title, instead of post title, it should just be called title, colon. You can either leave them at default name, or if you see that you have multiple, then you give them an alias. So for this one, I'll say the job title, colon. The next one is called phone, colon. And the last one is called the email, colon. So now if I do get data, you see it's getting the data for me. It's getting all of them, and it's using the alias for the name. For the featured image, because I didn't give it an alias, it's just going to return the identifier name as it is. And that's basically it. We can now start using this data however we want. But now, two things that we need to learn next are, one, we returned an ID. You can actually get rid of the ID because I never used it. But say we use the ID inside of our query, which we'll do sometime soon, and we don't really need the ID on the front end. We don't need it anywhere in the builder, only for maybe querying our post title or something like that. So we can now do what we call add a directive. So I'll say at. The moment you say at, there are three directives you can use. At private means use this within the query, but don't return it as an output. So it should be used within the input query, but not within the output JSON file. So I can say at private. And now when I do get data, you see that the ID disappears. Then the other thing we can do is we can modify our data using transform. And that transform is just basically what we call expression results. You can also learn about it within the docs about expressions. So if you search for expressions, these are the expression syntax. It should explain how to do different kinds of things. But what I'm going to do now is basically, I'm seeing that this listing agent is returning an array because I can see a square bracket. The moment you see a square bracket, it means it's an array. So there are two options now I can use with this data. I can either add in a collection element because I've seen it's an array. I'll use a collection element and work with that. But I've also seen that this listing agent, I'm only specifying one listing agent per property. I'm not using multiple listing agents. So instead of returning an array and having to use a collection element, I can now modify this data to make it into a static data. Some things that you need to learn are, there are some punctuations that you will need to learn. So when you see double quotes means a string, like we already know. Then if you see single quotes, usually it means a string as well, but in the context of an expression or another query. So once it's inside of quotes already. So let's say you already have outer double quotes, then whenever you're writing a string inside of that double quotes, you now have to write single quotes inside so that there is no confusion. Then we have two things. We have the dot notation and the square brackets. The dot notation is we're trying to access an item within an object. So you can say WP dot post dot title. So that means we're saying we're accessing the WP dynamic data variable. Within that WP, we're accessing the post object, and then within that post object, we're accessing the title. So that's where you use the dot symbol. Then we can use square brackets. These square brackets means two things. If it is in the return part, then it means it's an array. If it is in the identifier path, so let's say you put the square bracket in the identifier, it means that you are trying to access an item within the array. So on the identifier part, it means you're accessing an array. On the return part, it means you are creating an array. So you will learn about it a bit more. So let's go ahead and see it in action. So I'll go back into this, my query, and basically I want to convert this listing agent from an array into a single object. So to do that, what I'll do is I'll access the first item in the array. And that is very simple. So I'll go to my listing agent because that's where the array is actually. So I'll go to my listing agent, and where the input stops, so that is where these regular brackets stop, I'll go after that regular bracket and I'll put the @ symbol, and you now see @ transform. That we're trying to modify the data. Then we open regular brackets and we'll define what we're trying to transform. We're trying to transform with an expression. And the expression is, I want to take the current listing underscore agent. Then I want to access it, but I want to access only the first item within this listing agent. So I'll put square brackets and I'll put 0. So that's the first item. And I say get data. And see, it will convert it from an array into an object itself. So now it's easy. We can now access the data directly in the builder without having to use a collection element. So I can go ahead and save and start using the data in the builder. So first I'll go into this Eleanor and remove the current static data, go to dynamic stack and search for my title. But I'm looking for the one from the listing agent variable, and that's the listing agent title, okay? So we get our title. The next one is the job title. So I'll get rid of the static data and search for job title for the listing agent. Then the featured image, I'll convert this image URL into the correct URL, which is the featured image, but the one from the listing agent. We're looking for the file URL. Okay, there we go. And then for the alt text, same thing. I'll click on the dynamic stack and search for featured image for the alt text. And there we go. So we have everything correct. Next, we'll go ahead and add in the actual phone number. We want to add it with a tel. So we can do this tel inside of the URL panel, or we can do it directly in the dynamic data and modify the content of this dynamic data. However you choose to do it, it's your choice, but you have two options. You can modify the data directly from the query to add the tel, then the phone number, format the phone number how you want it, or you do it in the builder and say you want to add the tel colon on dynamic data for phone from the listing agent, and we have everything sorted out. We didn't have to use a collection element, although it's supposed to be an array. This is one beauty of Builderius. You can manipulate your data however you want. Then the last thing we'll also do is similar. We're trying to get this house is basically the taxonomy. So if you go under the properties and under the property type, that's where you see the one we're looking for in this property type. That's what we're looking for. So if you can convert it, instead of writing house, but since a taxonomy is not the current post. Like I said, the data from this whole WP variable is for current post, not for anything extra, anything outside. So if you want to get the taxonomy terms, then you'd need to get it with the dynamic data tag again. And I'll just create a new variable. So I can say this variable is going to be called the property type. And for this property type, so I'm going to get from the current post. And what we're looking for is, let me go ahead and write the comment again. So we're trying to look for the property type for the current property. So it is for the current property. So we need to start with the post. This is we're trying to access the current post. Press enter, it will automatically fill the information we need. That means we need curly brackets. What are we trying to access from the current post? I'm trying to access the ID, and I want to access the taxonomy terms. If they were native categories, we could have just searched for categories and pull in the data from categories. But these are not native terms, so we have to now do what we call a terms query. You can learn about that from the docs as usual. Everything is in the Builderius docs, or you can use these snippets and search for the taxonomy terms. So you can get that custom query taxonomy terms. Builderius already has functions for it, so you can use the snippets. This will also just populate with the data we are doing here, but I'm trying to show you how it is created. So I've gotten the post ID. Now I'm going to do the terms query. So terms query. Within the terms query, we have a couple of arguments. The arguments are what is the taxonomy, and the taxonomy is going to be called property type. Let me confirm. If I go into ACF and taxonomies, and I go into the property type, you see that the key is called property underscore type. So since it's a string, I'll put it in quotes and paste. It's my string. Then what else do I want to do? I want to get for the current post. So I'm going to use what we call object IDs. It's all written in the Builderius docs. If you just search for it, you'll see it. And you don't need to do all of this yourself. You can always rely on Sense AI. If you have subscription to any of these AI services, just feed in the information you want and it will automatically do it for you. But in this example, I'm trying to show you how to do it yourself. So now we see object IDs. Basically, the object IDs can be an array. That's why you saw a square bracket, or it can be a particular ID. So for accessing the particular ID, we just want to access this ID already for the current post. So the way we do it is, once we see that it is a sibling of the object we're trying to access, once it's a sibling, then we just do in quotes and double curly brackets. This is to start getting another item that is in the same query. And what we just do is, since it's a sibling, we just write the name of it, so ID. So I've gotten my taxonomy term for the query, and I've said it is for only the current post ID. Then the next thing we do is, okay, we have defined the query. Let's now define our output. What are we trying to return? We're trying to return a list of the terms that fit this criteria. So I'll say T, and you see terms. And the list of terms, within this list of terms, what are we trying to access? Because each term is an object. It has a name, it has a slug, it has so many things. So what are we trying to access? I think all I need to access here is the name in small letters. And that's it. That's basically all I need to access, because it's not clickable. It's just returning the name. So if I say get data, you see we now get the name is called flat, and that's it. And like I also mentioned before, because it is a terms query, it's going to return a list of terms. So you can either use the collection element to return this list of taxonomy terms, or in this case, I know that I'm only ever assigning one type of property to the property, because I don't think a house can both be a flat and a penthouse. It doesn't work. So it's either one or the other. So for that, I'm just going to convert this from an array into regular content. So I can go to my terms query, and then after the terms query, I'll put at transform, open regular brackets, expression. And the expression is, first I'll start with the name terms query, or I could just say this is a better name like property underscore type column. So now I can access that name called property underscore type. So that is, I'm accessing the first level. Then I want to access the second level, which is called terms. So I'll put a dot terms. And within that second level, I want to access the array, the first item in the array. So I'll now put square brackets and 0. That's the first item in the array. And that's it. Get data. And I'm getting my data now as a single value rather than an array. So the single value is just flat. And that's it. If I save, you don't need to actually save, but I just want to save just in case anything breaks. Then go to the house, replace the static data with my dynamic data, which was called the property type. And that is the one from the property type variable. And we get the name. So we're done with that. So that's how we can build out our whole query. We can also even do the next one, which is the similar properties. This is also going to be a query. And let's see how we can do that manually. So let's go ahead and save first. And for this, we'll need a collection element because we're going to return multiple items. So we need a collection element. And because it is the properties that are not the current property, we're trying to get other properties that is not the current one. We need to do a custom variable. So I'll go into my dynamic data and I'll create another custom variable and say this is called similar properties. You can do everything in the same variable if you want, but I'm just trying to do separate variables so I know exactly which one is which. So this is similar properties. I'll save and exit. And note that the naming convention is you have to do snake case. So that means name underscore next name underscore. You can't put spaces. You can't put dashes. You shouldn't put capital letters. It should just be small letters and underscores. That's all. So save and continue. And now for this one, let's go ahead and define it. So I'm going to get related properties to the current property. But how are they actually related? That's the question. How are they related? So we might say related properties by location because I'm saying similar properties nearby. So that means it's going to be by location. So by location taxonomy term. So that's something. So now let's now see how we build it out. It's quite simple. First, it is accessing something that is related to the current property. So I'll start with post. Then I'm doing a query of posts because I want to return a list of posts. And before I do that, I need to first know the ID of the current post. So I'll search for ID first. So I know I'm getting the current post ID. And I also need to get the current post terms because if those terms are now used to relate in my post query. So I'll say I want to get the terms query, which is why you might as well have done it in the other aspect. Let's just go back to the other one for property type. And instead of having to redo this again, we could have just used the same property type variable because we have already returned the name of the property. So let's just even do everything here because this is following up from the previous one is going to be similar. So we have the ID already. We have the type of property already. So now let's use this in our query. So all I'll do is go next. And we now start with a post query. Let me delete the other variable I wanted to create before. Delete that. And maybe instead of saying property type, I might as well just say this is called properties. Okay. Then close, 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 save, and Now I can start again. So under properties, I'll get data, but that will break. So let's get rid of the post query that we started first. Get data. Okay, it's getting the right data. I'll go away, and it has broken what we wrote before. So I just need to reassign the correct variable here. You can either just change the variable name directly inside from property underscore type to properties, and that should return it correctly. So just note that if you change the variable name, it will break every instance where the name was used, because these are static data that is written there. It doesn't automatically change. You have to go ahead and change the name yourself. Okay, so let's go ahead and save. And now I'll go back to my dynamic data, and I'll continue now. So within the same post, I will just continue and say, I want to do my post query. And this I'll say is called with an alias of similar underscore properties, colon. And what are the arguments? So the arguments are, one, we want to get the post type of, I think I called it property. Let's confirm. I'll go back to ACF, and under post types, the post type properties, the post type was called property. Yes, so I'm right. Then maybe posts per page. I think I only want 3 on the page. So posts per page, I'll say just 3. Then you can add extra features like maybe the publish status should be publish. Then I want to return a list of posts because they are similar property posts. So I want to return a list of posts. And within this list of posts, what are the items I want to return? I want to return the post title. So I'll say title. I can give it a nicer name like just title instead of post title. I want to return the, let's look at other things that we might want to return. We might want to return the title, the featured image, and the description. So post title, featured image. Within the featured image, I want the alt text and the file URL. And finally, I want the description. I think that's an ACF field, if I'm not mistaken. Oh no, it's an excerpt, I think. So let's try with an excerpt. And we'll first see if that gives us any content. So get data. Okay, so it was an excerpt. But this is now returning every post, not the posts related to the current property by the taxonomy term. So we now need to do a bit more filtering. So I will now come back to my query arguments, and I'll add an extra argument, which is called the taxonomy query, because I want to say I'm filtering this post query by this specific taxonomy. Then I'll say it's an array, and then within the array, it is going to say the taxonomy name is, okay, no, are we doing by type or by location? Oh, okay, it's by location, not by type. So I made a mistake. So we have to create another one called the terms query for the location. Let's just get rid of the taxonomy query so it doesn't break anything. And return our data. Make sure the data is returning. Okay, everything is returning. So I have to create a new one called location. And is the terms query as well. And the arguments are the taxonomy is for my location, not my property type. And the object IDs is same thing. The current ID. Then we want to get the list of terms, and we just want to get the name. So get data, or in this case, I may want to get the slug, because I think for taxonomy queries, it's better to use slugs or the term IDs than the name, because the name might be the same. So we prefer to use either a slug or the term ID. So whichever one you prefer. So let's say by slug in this case. So we've gotten our array of terms by slug, but similar thing, I just want only one term, not multiple terms. So I'll do the same transform that I did before. So after the terms query, regular brackets, I'll say at transform expression is going to be location dot the terms and just the first item. And what I want to return is just the slug if I want. So that just makes life easier for me. And I get the slug. So now I can now use this slug in my post query. So within the post query, now I can create a taxonomy query. So tax query array, and I want the taxonomy to be location. The field that I'm trying to get is the slug, and the terms are, I'm just going to reference my location. So I'm going to do double curly brackets and location. Get data. It shows null. I think that's because this transform doesn't typically work well like this. So I have to start by saying this location is going to be like the location raw. Then rather than using a transform, I'll still take the same expression, but rather than a transform, I'll do it as a separate expression. So expression result with the same expression. And I'll paste that data there. Remove the transform. Just the transform. And get data. So it's getting that data. I'll call this actually the location. And I'll get data now. I forgot to convert it from location to location underscore raw, which was the name I put there before. Get data. And now we get our correct data. So this apps transform is usually when we want to use it inside of the builder as an output. But when we're using the query, again, for something else directly in the dynamic data editor, we need to use what we call the expression result as a separate entity. So yeah, that's all I have to do. So just first of all, I have to do the location underscore raw as the actual taxonomy. Then I can now go ahead and hide this taxonomy. I'll say at private to hide it, because we don't really need this raw version. All we just need is the similar properties. So I can hide all of the information that I don't need, so that only the information that we need that is going to be shown to the users. So I'll hide the first one. I'll hide the ID as well. At private for the ID. And so we only have the property type, the location, and the similar properties. So that's all we need. And you see, we're getting 3 properties, and all of them have the same location. If you go to the backend, and you see that they all relate by that location that we've set up. Okay, so that's it. Then let's go ahead and replace this static data with dynamic data. So those are the 3 items. I'll go ahead and just take one of the items out of the grid, and I'll delete the entire grid, because I only need this one item, which is the related card. Okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll add a collection element. Take that to the top. Drop in my card into it. And that's it. So now we just have to define the collection. So the collection is going to be a UL again, I think. If you want, or let's just leave it as a div in this example. Then we go to the data source. Because our similar properties is an array, it will automatically show up here. So I can just search for similar. You see similar properties. And we get that. All we need to do now is just add in our CSS. So I'm just going to say the related grid. And there we have it. So now we have it showing up 3 items dynamically. But because we haven't defined the output, we've only just defined the input dynamic data, not really the output dynamic data. So let's go ahead and replace the static data with dynamic data. But I'll first delete all of these other items that we don't need, remove. Then start defining the dynamic data. So I'll go to the featured image, remove the old value, and put in the new value, which is my loops featured image file URL. Remove the alt text, replace it with my loops featured image alt text. Then the title, remove the title, replace it with my loops title. Then the excerpt, I'll remove it and replace it with my loops post excerpt. And finally, I might want to add a link. I forgot to add a link, so I'll go back to my dynamic data. And this time I'll say I want to add an extra, which is the permalink, but I'll say maybe I want to have an alias of URL, and then I'm looking for the permalink. So even the post excerpt, I don't really need it called post excerpt. I can say I just want it to be called excerpt. Get data, go back and replace the URL with URL, and also replace the post excerpt if I can find it. And this is something I wish Builderius would change, because if the element is not highlighted or is collapsed in the structure panel and I click on the element in the builder, it doesn't automatically take me to the item. I have to first expand it, then I can now click on the item in the preview and to show me in the builder. So they need to fix that. But yeah, so I've gotten in there. I just need the excerpt to be, rather than post excerpt, I want it to be excerpt. And to pull in the data correctly. We can also modify this excerpt a bit to say we want to limit the words to maybe only 25 characters and all of that. So I can say limit underscore words, and then this is the function name, and I want to limit the words by maybe to 25 words, something like that, and it automatically limits my words to 25 words. So this is something you can do. Let's go ahead and save, and we're done with the main section. The other thing we'll now look at is how to create our filter system on the home page. To navigate to the home page template, we don't need to leave the builder. All we have to do is you simply click on the Builderius file menu, then look under pages, you see home. Click on it. It will open the home page as a new tab within the same builder. I would recommend that you don't leave the builder to edit a template in a different builder, because currently there is no global sync. So what that means is if you mistakenly change the global styles on that other template in a different page, it will affect the global styles on the current template, and there'll be kind of a conflict and everything will just not work as you expect. So make sure you are building everything within the same Builderius editor. You have the option to add as many tabs as possible and switch between tabs. If I click on one tab, it switches to that tab, click again, switches to the next tab, and I can continue working. So now let's see how we can build out this filter system. It's similar to what we've always been doing, so there's not much difference. We have to first of all create a custom variable, then we'll now do some manipulation of that data variable. So for example, you see right now with our filters, it's a select field, but I'm manually adding my opt group and my options to form the options. That is not great, because what if we add a new location, which is already a problem here because the location names here are actually even wrong. So that shows already that it's a problem. So how can we now fix this problem? We use the collection element because it's a loop of items. And first we need to define our query that we're going to be using in the collection element. So I'll go over to dynamic data. It's going to be for the current template only. So template level, add a variable, and I think I'll just name it filter, because that's what I'm just going to be doing, filtering. Save and open. And the first filter is going to be for our location. So I'll start by saying location as the alias name, and it is basically a list of all of our terms, starting with the top level terms. If I go back just so we can have it visually, and I go to my properties and locations, you see the top level are Hertfordshire, London, and Surrey. So those are the top level ones. So we want to have those top level items as what we call opt group. So just going to be show like labels inside of our drop down. But then the one that we are more concerned about is the second level. So how do we now create these nested levels of taxonomy terms? It's really simple. I'll go back And I'll start with a terms query, because what we're trying to do is return. You can always give it a comment so that you know exactly what you're trying to do. We're trying to return a nested listing of our taxonomy terms from the location taxonomy. So that means we're doing a query, so terms query, and we're trying to return terms from the taxonomy called location. And we're trying to return all terms. So it doesn't matter if it has items or not. We just want to return all terms. So I'll say hide empty should be false or 0. Then I'll also say that the parent does not exist. So I'll say a parent of 0. That means I want to get the top level items first. Now what I want to return are the list of terms. And within those list of terms, I want to return the term name and the term slug. It is the slug that we're using as our filter system. That's how I envisioned it. We're going to be using what we call URL parameters. So we'll send all of these slugs to the property listing. So let's show you an example. Let me first get data to make sure it's working. It's returning data, save, and we'll go ahead and see an example. So here's an example of, let's say, the home page. So in the home page, I'll go ahead and do some filtering. So let's say I want to choose a location of, let me give an example of maybe St. Albans. Then the property type, let's say it's a penthouse. And the minimum number of bedrooms, let's say is 2. And maximum price, let me say the maximum one of, let's say 2 million, something like that. And I do a search. It will take me to the property page, and then to add a filtering system. That's the whole idea of how I made it to work. So to just add a filtering system for me using the query parameter, and then I'll just extract that query parameter to create my filtering for my loop grid. That's all I'm doing. So now how do I build it? It's really simple. If I go back to my property, so now I've defined the top level. I also want to get the next level, that is the children. In the terms query, we can easily get the children by just typing children. The name is so simple. Children is children. Then I want to get the same thing, which is the name and the slug. So if I do get data now, I'm getting my data exactly as it is on the back end. So that is the job done. That's all we need for the location taxonomy. We can also do the same thing for the others so that we just do all at once. So the next one is the property type. So I can say property underscore type colon, and it's going to be a terms query again. And within those terms query, the taxonomy is going to be property underscore type, hide empty should be false. And this time for the property type, there is a flat list. So it doesn't have any parents already. So I don't need to bother about the parents. I can ignore that. Then all I want to do is now return the terms. So the list of terms, and I want just the name and the slug as usual. Get data. If you go down to the bottom, you see we're now getting our property types with the following names. So that is done for the second one. For the third one, which is the meta fields, that's a list of meta fields for bedrooms. We don't really have a way to access that data. So what we can do is one of two things. We can either manually write the JSON data within the collection element. It allows us to do that. Or we can also create another data variable here with our manual array. So what do I mean? I can come down to the bottom here, and I'll say maybe min underscore beds colon. And this one, I'm just going to define a manual array. So I'll say expression result. That's the easiest way to do anything that is not really a query, but it's like data that we want to manipulate. We use expression result for that. And I'll just write it simply the way you write an array. I'll write it here directly. So square brackets, and I'll put curly brackets inside for each object. So the first object is, I want the same thing. I'm just going to do name and slug. So the name, single quotes, because I'm already in double quotes. Let me go ahead and zoom in a little bit so it's easy to see. So the name, colon, should be, first name is maybe any, and comma, the slug should be colon, a blank one for the first one, And that's how you just keep going for each of the objects within the array. So you do comma. Let me just go ahead and copy. And that's it. Can I go ahead and get data? And you see our data is now returning a JSON file for us of an array of any 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can build out your array here. We do the same thing for the maximum price. You can just build it out here. So we just copy the one we have already, create a new one, and this time is going to be called the max underscore price. We're done with that. Get data. We see we get our data. So all of this data is now populated correctly in our filter system. In fact, we're going to be using this filter system multiple times. So I think the best way is to put it as a global variable. To make it a global variable, I'll just right click and say move to global. And that's it. And now we can start using this data inside of our form. So all I just did was create a form with 4 inputs that are select fields. Although you might notice that if you go into the element inserter at the moment and search for select, it tells you coming soon, but that doesn't really stop you because Builderius exposes every HTML tag to you. So all you have to do is just add in a regular element. So for example, I can go in and add, let's look for the first one. So this first select field, I can delete that select field and add in my own select field. But because it's a list, we're going to be using a collection element. Just remember, anytime we're doing a list of items and we want to do it dynamically, then add a collection element. So I'll go to the field group, add in my collection element, make it just after the label. And this collection element, I'll make it have an HTML tag of select. Then within the template, the child is going to be called an option. So I'll add anything. So maybe a paragraph tag, add anything. Just change the HTML tag to option. And it automatically set it up as an option. So on the select field, we now define our data source. So for the first one, the data source is going to be any location. That is my location CPT. So I'll go to my select field. Then I'll choose the data source as my location. Choose that location. Then now within the option, it will now automatically pull in the query for me. So I'll choose the dynamic tag, and you can see the first one is the name and the value is going to be the slug. And we now have our list of names there. But like I mentioned, it's supposed to be the opt group first. So all I have to do is now change it to an opt group. But that opt group itself, if you think about it, the opt group itself is also having another listing. So the opt group is listing the options within the opt group. So for that, we now do something with the collection element again. So we need another collection element nested within the parent collection element. But whenever we're nesting collection elements, we use the more specialized one called the sub collection. So if you search for collection, you see that there's a separate one called the sub collection. That's whenever we have a collection within a collection, the second one is going to be a sub collection. So I will now replace my option inside of my template. Instead of using an option, I'll use the sub collection. And that sub collection will now become my opt group. And this opt group will now have the option within it. Because that's how the HTML is on the front end. We have the select field, then we have opt groups, then within the opt groups, we have options. Okay, so now let's pull in the correct data. So on the opt group and our options, now you see that everything is already pulling in correctly. So we have Hertfordshire, London, Surrey, but we have to now define on our sub collection what exactly are we pulling. So under the sub collection, the data source is just going to be the same thing, our children. And now it's going to pull everything correctly. So you can see the children now. St. Albans, Barnet, Camden, and everything, the children are pulled in correctly. But we're not seeing the label of the ops group. Why? Because we're not defined the label on the sub collection element. So I'll go back to my sub collection element, which is my ops group. Then under attributes, I'll add a new attribute, and the attribute is just going to be called label. That's the attribute we use. So if I go ahead and search for opt group in the MDN docs, you see how it works. So the opt group just has a label equal to the label you want it to be, and it automatically show up as the label there. So that's what we are working with. So the label is just going to be my term name, and that's all. So now if I drop down, you see that it's now pulling in the right data. All I have to do left is to do 3 things. 1, I'll style it. 2, I'll add an ID. And 3, I'll add a name, because that name is what is going to be shown within the URL parameter when we submit our form. Okay, so first I'll add the styles. So I'll go to my select, which is my main collection element. I'll go to the styles tab, and I'm just going to style it as the select from my filters. Then under the content tab, add attributes. The first is the ID. So I'm saying the ID is going to be something like maybe S location, just an ID, because the ID is what will be attached to the label. So if you go to the label, this for property on the label is supposed to be attached to the ID of your select field. So that's all you have to do. So I already named it S location here. So that's why I named the ID S location. Then the other thing you need to do is go back to the select field, and this time you give it a name. The name is what is going to be used in the URL parameter. So I'll say the name is something like filter underscore location. The reason why I added filter behind the location is that WordPress uses taxonomy names for some other processing. So don't use the taxonomy name as is. Most page builders always add their own name. So like I think with Elementor, they have the e-filter or something like that, just so that it is separate from the WordPress naming convention. Okay. Then I can get rid of the static select field. And that's exactly what you do for the rest of them. So the rest of them, you just need the options because they're all flat lists. The only one that is a nested list is the first one. The others are flat lists. So just add the collection element, you add your option within the template, and then you choose the dynamic data source, and that's it. Then just give it an ID and a name and connect the ID to the label. That's all. And then you add a button of type equal to submit, and it should work automatically. You don't need to write any JavaScript or anything. This should just automatically work because I'm using a form element. So if we go back to the beginning of the elements, you see that it is a form element, and all you are doing is under the attributes, we have to give it an action, which is where exactly is it going to. That is the action. Then the method, we're using a get because we want to show it in the URL parameter, is a simple submit form. So we just use the get. If it's something more secure, we use the post submit method. But for now, just the get is okay. And that's it. Those are the 2 things you need. You just need the action and the method. And then we save. So now I've already gone ahead and I've filled in all of the information. So you can see all the information are now correct. We have everything pulled in the dynamic data, just basically choosing the data source, then giving it a name and an ID, and then choosing the option, which has the same thing as the rest. So just name and slug, same thing. So now if I go ahead and save and preview the front end, we now have our filter. I can filter all of them and do a search. And if you look at the top bar, the filters add all of the items that we set up. But you notice that at the moment, there is no default value for the location and the property. It's just choosing a property automatically. How do we now add the same any location or things like that to it when we are using dynamic data? It's quite simple. If I go back to my option, you can do it in one of 2 ways. You can go directly into the dynamic data and try to manipulate the dynamic data, or you can just add static item within your select field. So I choose my select field and I'll just go ahead and drop in a new item. But that item just has to be outside of the template because it's the template that gets repeated anything outside of the template becomes static data. So I'll just put one item before the template and make that an option. And now within this option, I can say maybe this one is called any property or any type. And the value is just going to be a blank space. So that's any type. Do the same thing for the top select field. For that, I'm just going to duplicate my default value. So duplicate it and pull that before the template. And this one is going to be called any location. And that's it. Save. And I'll preview on the front end, refresh. We now have those placeholder text. So the any location, any type, any, and so on. So all of that works. And if I go and search on the front end, it will also work. So now let's see how I am able to now use this filter system inside of my actual property archive page. So we'll go back to the builder and I'll open the property archive page. So that's under templates and we have the property archive. Now in the property archive page, you'd ideally want to go ahead and copy the filter form from your other page into this page if you want. I'm just going to ignore it. But what we're focusing on is the results. We need to filter the results by our URL query parameter. So how do we do that? We need a collection element because we are getting a result. So I will go ahead and look for where the grid starts. So this card, I'm just going to copy one of the cards and delete everything else. So delete the entire grid. Then I'll add a new grid, which is a collection element. So I'll go to the collection element and drop that at the right spot. And this is going to be my grid. So we'll go ahead and now drop in my card into the grid. Ideally, you now wrap the card in a list if that's the way you want it to be, but we're just focusing on the dynamic data in this case. So I'll paste in my card into the template. So now the collection element can be whatever you want it to be, but we need the data source for the collection element. That's the most important part. The data source is now supposed to pull in data from our URL query parameter. So we now have to create a custom data source because this is not normal. This is not how the data is supposed to be pulled in our archive page. So we need a custom data variable. So I'll go into my data variable. Let's go ahead and save first. Go to my dynamic data. And now for the current template, I'm going to be saying it's maybe the filtered archive. So first thing we need to know is that, okay, we're doing a query of posts. So we start with the post query. But before we do the post query, we need to now pull in those URL parameters. Those 4 URL parameters that we created, we need to pull them in. So I'll give them aliases. I'll say the first one is LOC for location, and it's going to be URL parameter. That's the identifier or the function name. And what is the name of the parameter? It's going to be called filter underscore location. Remember the name we did when we were creating the form? That name is what we're just replacing here. So the first name was filter underscore location. So we put that name here and that's it. Then we can now put a fallback. So what if the location was not added there? Maybe it was that any location that was blank. What will happen? So we need a fallback. And the fallback is simply going to be a blank, because if we don't put a fallback, what happens is that the builder will put a null, and null is not something we want to be adding to your post query. So we need something in our post query if it does not exist. So we'll put a fallback of just blank space. So now if you do a check, you see LOC now returns blank. Do the same thing for the next one. I'll say that is called type or p type, because if I type type, it shows a blue color. That means it's a reserved keyword. So I'll need something else. So I'll say p type colon. And that was the same thing, URL parameter. The name for this time will be filter underscore type. Then the fallback will be same thing, blank. The next one is the minimum number of beds. So I'll say maybe min underscore bed. And that will be URL parameter. The name, I believe the name was filter_beds. Let's confirm. Let me go ahead and just, first of all, save. Switch back to the home. This is one nice thing about having everything in the same builder, that you can just quickly switch tabs and see what you wrote. So I'll go to the main, select field, then let's close the dynamic data and search under the content. Under the attributes, I think I gave the name as filter_beds. So I was right, filter_beds. Go back, open my dynamic data, and I can continue from there. So the data was the filtered archive. So it was filtered_beds, yeah. And the fallback, this time, the fallback shouldn't really be blank because it's a meta query, and the meta query requires numbers. So we want to be returning numbers, not blank spaces. Though with other ones, these are strings. That's why we say we want to return a blank string. But for numbers, we don't want to return a blank number. We want to return an actual number. So we'll say if there is no URL parameter, the minimum number of beds should be 0. That means it should be from 0 and above. So say fallback should be 0. And then the max price, that is how much would be the maximum price for our properties. So that will be the URL parameter again. And the name will be filter_price. The fallback for this one is the opposite. If we don't have a maximum price, we need it to be like infinity. So a very high number. So I'm just going to say 999,999,99. So it's a very high number. So if I now do get data, you see blank, blank, 0, and 999. Because there's no URL query parameter in the builder here. If there was the URL query parameter that fits this URL parameter names, it will have shown up something in the builder. Okay, so now that we have these information, the next thing we need to do now is start our query. But there's something else I will also try to add as a conditional logic, and that is we don't want our taxonomy query to be looking for blank space. So we'll do something extra. So I'll say something like the comparison. Let's first create the query, then I'll show you what I mean. So let's say we're starting with the posts query, because we're looking for a list of posts that are from the properties post type. So the post type is called property. The posts per page, I'll say, is maybe 12. And the post status is maybe publish. I'm just doing the very bare minimum for now. Then I'll say I want to return the list of posts. And within the list of posts, I want to return the post title, the excerpt. I'm just doing the basic ones, so nothing major. You can now add the content that you need. So I want the excerpt, and maybe I want the featured image, something like that. So for the alt text and the file URL. If I do get data, what's happening now is that it's returning all of our posts, but not in any specific filtering. So now we need to filter these posts to satisfy the condition of our URL query parameter. For the first two query parameters, they are targeting taxonomies. So we need a tax query for those ones. For the other two query parameters, they are targeting meta fields. So we need a meta query. So we need a taxonomy query and a meta query. So I'll go into my post query now, and within the input arguments, I'll now do a tax query, and I'll say the relation is and, because I'm saying location and the property type. So I'll say the relation is an and relationship. Then the array is what are the array of the taxonomy terms that I'm trying to filter by. So the first one is the taxonomy of the location. And what am I filtering by is the field of slug. And the terms is the terms from my URL query parameter. And that's just called LOC. So I'll go in there and I'll say in quotes and double curly brackets LOC. Then the next one is still within the array. I'll create a new object. So I can put a comma if you want or not. As long as you are in a new line, Builderius will automatically add the comma, and it's the same thing. So it's another array of taxonomy. This time the taxonomy name is the property underscore type. The field is the slug again, and the terms are in quotes and curly brackets 2. The next one was called p type. So that's p type. The last thing we need to do is define how is it going to be compared. Let me use the Control I to see what we have. So we have condition, we have field, include children, operator, taxonomy, and terms. So we can say maybe the include children should be yes. So that's true. And operator. The operator is, let's go ahead and read out the taxonomy query, how it works. So for the operator, this is what we use. It accepts the following: and, in, not in, exists, or not exists. So what we're going to say is that if our URL query parameter has a value, we should use this in. Otherwise, if it doesn't have a value, if you add a fallback of the blank, then we should use this exists. So we're going to add a conditional logic. So first is in or exists. So now let's go back to our builder, and we're just going to create another one called the LOC operator so that we can easily understand it. LOC underscore OP. And this is going to be a conditional logic using expression result. So we're going to say if the LOC exists, then we put a question mark. That's how the ternary operator works with PHP and with Builderius as well. So we'll say if LOC exists, then return it as, in single quotes, IN. Otherwise, I'll put a colon, return it as if it exists. Because I think that's how it's called, exists. So it's supposed to be if it exists. Yes, that's it. So for the second one, it's going to be very similar. So let's go to copy the LOC. And I'll say for the P type, same thing. So if the P type underscore OP, the expression is if the P type, notice that when I'm writing within this expression results, I don't need to put the double curly brackets to reference data variable. All I have to just do is write the name. But then if it's a string, I have to put single quotes. So that's the difference, that if we're in expression results, we can get rid of the double curly brackets for variables, but for strings, we now switch to using single quotation marks, and that's it. So the same thing, if it exists, use in, otherwise use exists. Then I can now reference this new variable within the query for taxonomy. So for the operator, so now say, let me reference the LOC underscore OP for the first one. And the second one, I'll do the same thing. Just copy, paste that. And this time it's not LOC, but it's P type underscore OP. Okay. Now let's see if everything works. It should still return some data because we already had some fallbacks. So if I return data, it's still returning data. So that means it's working. We can now test it on the front end to make sure everything works. So I'll go ahead and save and preview on the front end. And this time I'm going to say, go back to my builder because I've not yet changed the filter in the archive page. So I'll say now I want it to be maybe bonnet. The property type should be a flat or maybe just any type because I'm not sure which ones I chose. And I need 2 bedrooms and a maximum of 1.5 million. I'll do a search. And it says no homes. Why? Because I actually haven't used the variable actually in the builder. So now I have to go back into the builder and go to my collection element. So I have the collection element there. Then choose the data source. Remember to actually put the data source into the builder. Data source. And I'm going to look for my filtered archive. So that's the one. Paste that in. And automatically it's pulling in data. So it's pulling in some data. So now let's go ahead and save and we'll try it out again. So now we already have our filter. Let me just refresh the page. And now it says it's returning only 4 properties. If I do another filter, it will return maybe 2 properties and so on. So it will return the properties that fit the description. So what I'm just going to do now is put in the correct data in, and then we'll refresh the page. So we have the featured image, then we have the post title, then maybe we want the permalink. So let me call the post title as title, the post excerpt as excerpt, the permalink as URL, or the permalink. Then the rest are ACF fields. So I'm just going to add them in and we'll continue from there. So we don't waste too much time. So you just ACF underscore value. I believe the first one is called price. Then we have ACF underscore value for bed. Then I think we need the bats, but we don't need that for the filters. So we just need these 2 for the filters. This is enough. Let's go ahead and populate with the data so that we can see that the filter works. So now we'll start populating the page with the dynamic content. So the first one is the featured image. Let's put in the right featured image. So featured image, the file URL, and it's getting the right data. Okay, so that's it. We can now go ahead and refresh this page with our filters active, and you can see our filter was that we want the location to be Barnet, the number of beds to be 2, and the price to be anything below 1.5 million. So you now notice that nothing above 1.5 million shows up. Then everything is in Barnet. So we have one in Finchley, that's in Barnet. We have one in High Barnet and Finchley. So these are all subcategories under Barnet. And that's because we said it should include the children. If we had chosen not to include the children in our terms query, if we have chosen that we don't want to include children, then it will only show things that have that top level filter taxonomy term, but that would not work because we are only choosing the last level, and that would have caused an issue. But yeah, everything works. And yeah, that's it for returning data in a filtered way. The last one we'll just look at briefly is how to return a nested listing of our taxonomy terms within a posts list. This was asked by one of the community members, and I'll show you an example of what we are trying to achieve. And you can see within the archive blog page, this is what he wants, that within the list of cards for the archive blog page, he wants to be able to show something like maybe filed under, then you show a nesting of all of the taxonomy terms. This was gotten from the post categories. So if I go into my backend and I go to posts and all posts, you see that they have their categories. So they have first-time buyers and Primrose Hill, Camden and Sell Your Home, mortgages and finance, with the other category as Surrey. And if you go into the categories themselves, you see how the nesting looks like. So the idea is that you want to show area guides, column, London, then column Camden. If that's what I chose, if I chose Camden, it should show area guides, column, London, column, Camden, or something like that. If I choose selling your home, it should show buying and selling, then maybe a carrot or something, and then show selling your home. So just basically show the nesting, like you're trying to create a breadcrumb. So now let's see how we can do that. So I'll go back to my builder and I will go into the post archive page under my templates and the blog index. So under the blog index, let's go ahead and just add in a query. How you're going to present it on the front end, that is up to you. So let's go ahead and just do the query itself. So I'll go ahead and create a new query and I'll call it something like blog underscore archive. And in this blog archive, I'm just going to do a query of my posts. So archive first, because I'm in an archive page, I'll start with archive. Then within that archive, I want to return a post query. And what I want to return within the post query is a list of the taxonomy terms, because first of all, when you're in the blog index page, you cannot really control the query itself of posts. You are returning posts based on the archive template, But what we're trying to now focus on is changing the template of the card itself. So I'm doing the post query first for all of my cards. And what are the return? I want to return the list of posts. Notice that it only showed us the post query. It doesn't show us how to modify the input. The only thing we can modify is the output. So there's no regular bracket, only curly brackets. Then we can now continue. So we did the posts. I want to return the post title. And I can just give that a nice name of title. Then I want to return maybe the excerpt with a nice name of excerpt. But that's not the main focus. The main focus is the nested taxonomy terms. So for that, what we're going to do is within our posts, we do a terms query. So how are we going to approach this? First, we need to get the list of terms that are for the current post. So for that, we do a terms query, and then we say maybe the taxonomy should be, in this case, is native posts, native categories, native tags. So I'll just say category. The object IDs is going to be my current post ID. So I have to first of all get the current post ID. And that object ID is just going to reference my current post ID. Then I'm returning a list of terms. Within the list of terms, I need the name and maybe I need the slug, something like that. Get data. So now I'm returning all of the terms related to each post. So I'm returning a list of posts first. Then I'm now returning all of the terms related to that post. That is the first step done. The next thing we need to do is now return the ancestors of the term. There's a PHP function within WordPress called getAncestors. That's the way we will now be able to get all of the list of the parent terms of the current term that you're looking for. We just need to go within these terms. I can also say I want to get the term ID. But within these terms, what I want to return now is something with a PHP function output called getAncestors. Then I'll give it a nice name of ancestors. Then we now have to do some arguments. This is the function name called getAncestors. So the arguments are, we need to now define three things. So let me go ahead and pull up the getAncestors function so that we see how it works. So within the WordPress system, so getAncestors, we can see the function called getAncestors, and it needs three items. So it needs what is the current object ID. We already have that. That's the term ID. Then it needs what is the object type that we're trying to return. The object type requires the name of the post type or the taxonomy we're trying to access, which in this example is going to be called category. And then finally, we want to see what is it? Is it a post type or a taxonomy? It's a taxonomy. We're getting the ancestors of the taxonomy term. Okay, so now let's go back. So the three things we need are the current term ID, so term underscore ID. We need maybe a comma if you want, or you put a new line. The next one is what is the actual name of the taxonomy, and that is called category. And then finally, what is it? It's a taxonomy. So now let's go ahead and get data, and you see that it's now returning the IDs of the ancestors. So it's giving us the first thing, the IDs of the ancestors. But unfortunately, the way it returns the IDs is in reverse order. It sends it with the closest ancestor first, then next ancestor. That is the way this array works. So what we now do is add a new function. I'll give it the name of reverse. Basically, we want to use another PHP function called array reverse to reverse the array so that it starts with the grandparent first, before the parent, and then before the child. So I'll do an array reverse, but let me give it a nice name like ancestor ordered colon, and that will be PHP function again. And the function is called array underscore reverse. Let's go ahead and see how array reverse works. So basically what we are just going to do is the array reverse, and then we just need to put what the actual array is, and that's it. Just feed in the actual array as the argument. So this function is array reverse, comma, the argument is the name of the function, and that is just going to be referencing in quotes, double curly brackets, the ancestors. Get data, and you see that now it just reverses the order of the list. It just reverses them. That's all. So we can hide the initial ancestors. We don't need that. All we need is the actual ancestors ordered. So I'll say at private. In fact, we can also hide the ancestors reverse. We don't need that as well. We are going to now do the next step, which is we'll now include this current term ID into the ancestors and form our term tree. So now I'll go to the next level and say terms underscore tree. Just give it a nice name. And this is just going to be, we want to put our current term ID and push it into the list that we already have of the ancestors ordered. We have a nice function in Builderius, the push function. It is under the name for array functions. If you just go to array functions and you read through the array functions, you can see so many things you do with arrays. So now within the push function, what we need to do is look at them. The first one says we want to add our option to the end of the other option. You can see an example. So that's how the push works. So push, you put the array and then the new item. So that is push our ancestors ordered and then our term ID. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll put expression result whenever I want to do that function. The function name is now push in brackets. The same way we are writing the function is just we will write it here directly. So the name is called push. What is the array? The array is called ancestors ordered. Let me copy that. Since we are already within the expression, we don't need to put the curly brackets. We just put the name of the function, which is ancestors ordered, then a comma, and the term ID. Let's see if everything works well. Get data. And now we see our list. We have term ID of 43. We have 40, 41. And now you see 40, 41, 43. Those are all of the IDs returning successfully. So we're getting what we need. The final thing we need to do now is be able to get the name of the terms from this array. We have the array, but we need to know the names of those terms that are related to that array. So for that, we now do yet another function because now we have an array of our term IDs. What we can now do is we'll do another terms query and then feed in this array that we have into that terms query and say we want the terms that only include these terms, and then we can now start retrieving the data from that. I hope I've not lost everybody, but this is how we do it. So now within this list of terms, we have our list of terms that is returning all of this function. We're now going to do another terms query within this list of terms. So within this list of terms, we cannot do another terms query. So we're doing a nested terms query now because we've gotten the IDs that we need. We've gotten all of the IDs we need. We now want to do a terms query, and we're just going to do some things like the taxonomy is going to be our category. The important bit now is what we call include. So I say we're only going to include the categories that are shown within this terms tree. So I'm just going to remove this because it's already an array. We don't need to put it inside another array. I'm just going to put the double quotations, double curly brackets, and I say terms underscore tree. Then what are we returning? We're returning a list of terms, and within those list of terms, we just need the name and the slug and whatever other thing we need, like maybe we might need the term ID, and we need something like the get terms link to return the link of the term, but we're not going to do that in this video. But yeah, that's it for our list. So now we get our list of terms. So let me go ahead and hide all of the items we don't need. We don't need the term ID, so I can hide that. We don't need the actual name. Let me just get rid of those. We can hide the ordered by as well, the function for the ordered taxonomies, because all we really need is this list of terms. And now we are returning just the important information we need. We are returning posts, and then with those posts, we're returning our array of the breadcrumbs. So we can now use this however we want, in whatever fashion that we want. So that's left to you to do. That's exactly what I did in my own design. So when I go over to the blog index and I go over to dynamic data, that's exactly what I did to get the data. So you can see the term ID, the name, and the PHP function output. Because it's a category, we can just use get category link. If it's a custom taxonomy, then use get terms link and so on. And then that's what I use to get my data into the right format that I want. So yeah, that's it for the main aspects of getting dynamic data from items within the current WordPress website. One last thing we'll try to test out is how do we get items from an external source? So like an external API result, how do we now pull in that data into Builderius? So now let's look at an example. So here we are back in the Builderius editor in a new blank page. First thing I'm going to do is add in a new section. Then I'll add a heading. And that's just going to say something like external API. Then the next thing we do is we're trying to pull in data that might be repeating from an external API. So we need the collection element. So I'll drop in my collection element. And one thing that you would need to know is that this collection element, within the collection itself, the data source accepts anything that returns an array. So it could be a static array. For example, let me first go ahead and drop in something in the template so we can see. And let's just give that something simple like test. Right now you see nothing. But the moment you go into this data source and add in a static JSON, so I can start by opening the array with square brackets, and I'll add my items. So I'll add maybe objects with key value pairs. So open and close curly brackets, and I'll say maybe something like title colon is David. Then I'll do a comma after the curly brackets, open a new set of curly brackets. Title colon is Joshua. Remember that you have a comma after each item. It's in curly brackets, and you always have to have quotation marks for the key value pair because they are both strings. And you see there is no error. If there was an error, they will have had a warning sign. Now we have everything, and you can see directly in the builder that we're already having two items, but they are returning tests. The reason is that we haven't shown what the loop item we're trying to return in the template. So we have to go back into the paragraph, remove this test, and reference some of the sub keys. So the dynamic stack, and we're trying to reference the title, and we get our title automatically. So that works. The other way we can do it is on the collection element, we can add a URL to something that returns an array. So that's the beauty of this collection element, that as long as it returns an array, it will work. So for example, we can use the popular version, which is the REST API from WordPress for a site that is not protected by any authentication. So something like WP Tavern, just drop it there. You just put in the URL of where the thing is, and you can see automatically it's already pulling in a number of data. And all I have to do is just choose the correct item. So I choose title, and it's returning title. I can choose dynamic data, and you can look at all of the data that is available. So let's say title. And we get something like the title rendered, and we get our information. So it works. Everything just works. So that is another way. As long as it's returning an array, it will work. But the more popular way is to use the dynamic data so that we can manipulate the data however we want. So for example, let's say I have information from the dog CEO website. Let's say I just want to return a random image. So let's go ahead and copy this URL. Then I'll come back to my WordPress website, and then I'll go into dynamic data, and I'll choose to create a new variable, and I'll call this one maybe external API. And what you can easily do is delete what is there in the information, go into snippets, and search for remote. You see, remote query basic and remote query advanced. We choose the basic one, and we paste that basic one there. And you can see the information that is coming up with WP Tavern, the same example we had with WP Tavern. Get data, and you can see the data that is being returned. You can now manipulate the data however you want. This is the data that is returned. You have the freedom to manipulate it, or we can go ahead and use the advanced option. So I'll say snippet advanced, paste that advanced option. You can see that this one has a bit more. You can read through it, see how it's able to help you to format the data properly. So let's go ahead and do get data now, and you see the difference. With this one, we're now returning a more styled version. So I can use this version, and I'll do the same thing about going and replacing this URL with the dog API URL. Copy, and I'll paste it there. Do a get data, and now we're getting the data we need. All we need is the message inside of that, and we can just use this. Since it's returning an object, not an array, we can just call this from any image element anywhere without the collection element. So that's the difference between using the data source in the collection element. For that one, we need a collection element. But if we're using dynamic data, we can manipulate the data however we want and maybe return only one item. And we can just reference an image item on the page. So within the section, I'll just drop in an image and just look for something from my remote data. I think it's called message. So let's search for message. Yeah, message from the external API, and it gets the image. If I save it and go to the front end, you see a new image will be shown. If I refresh the page again, we'll get yet another image, and that's how it works. So the external API works this way. So yeah, that's the bulk of how to use dynamic data in Builderius. For the most part, I think you'd rely on the snippets and maybe Sense AI, because Sense AI can just create this data for you. But this is just a learning experience to learn how to pull in the dynamic data yourself so that you are confident in using dynamic data within Builderius. I believe later they will be adding more of the visual way of adding dynamic data so that you can easily add more dynamic data without having to rely on creating custom variables. But this is how you create your custom data variables. If you enjoyed the video, please do leave a thumbs up so that I know you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, any comments, let me know in the comment section. I will try my best to answer your questions, and let me know what other video you'd like me to talk about in the future. I'll see you in the next one.